I never thought I'd end up working at a morgue. I mean, who does? It wasn't exactly part of the life plan. But when you are a broke college student in a town where even the gas station has a wait list for new hires, you take what you can get. I found the job listing online, tucked between ads for babysitting and landscaping gigs. Part-time assistant needed, it read. No experience required. Competitive pay. I almost skipped over it. The word morgue caught my eye, and I immediately felt a knot of discomfort. But when I saw the line that said, "No direct interaction with the deceased," I told myself it couldn't be that bad. Cleaning floors? Taking out trash? I'd done worse for less. I called the number listed and spoke to the owner, Alan. He sounded normal, friendly even. Said he liked to meet applicants face to face and asked if I could come by that afternoon. Desperation has a way of silencing hesitation, so I said yes. The morgue was smaller than I expected. A plain, single-story building tucked behind a line of overgrown trees. Its beige exterior blended into the landscape, almost like it was trying to hide. Alan greeted me at the door with a handshake that was firm but not too firm. He looked like someone's dad, mid-40s, average build, with a streak of gray running through his dark hair. His smile was easy, his tone conversational. If I hadn't known better, I might have thought he worked in insurance. "Come on in," he said, holding the door open for me. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not unpleasant, but chemical. Sharp and cloying, like a mix of bleach and something I couldn't place. The hallway was narrow, with scuffed tiles and flickering fluorescent lights. It led to a larger common area with a cracked linoleum floor and a few mismatched chairs pushed against the wall. Alan gave me the tour. "This is where most of your work will be," he said, motioning to the common area. "Mop the floors, take out the trash, keep things tight." Pretty straightforward. We passed his office next. A cluttered space with papers stacked on every surface. A fan buzzed loudly in the corner, barely moving the stagnant air. "Feel free to grab a drink from the fridge if you need," he offered. Finally, we stopped outside a heavy metal door at the end of the hallway. He didn't open it, just rested a hand on the frame. "This is the body room. You won't need to go in here unless I ask. Most of the time, I handle everything in this part of the building." Even without seeing inside, I felt the weight of what lay beyond that door. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. "So, what do you think?" he asked, his smile never faltering. "A job's a job," I said, though my voice wavered just enough for him to notice. "Good attitude," he said with a chuckle. "Can you start tomorrow?" And just like that, I was hired. The first night was uneventful, though the quiet unsettled me. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than it should have been, and every creak of the building made me glance over my shoulder. Cleaning the body room was the hardest part. Even though there were no bodies in sight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Alan, for his part, was kind enough. He'd pop out of his office to check on me, offering small talk or snacks from the stash he kept in his desk. Still, there was something about him I couldn't put my finger on. A little too precise in his habits, a little too practiced in his smiles. But I told myself I was imagining things. By the end of that first week, the job had become almost routine. I cleaned, mowed the lawn out back, and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that seemed to follow me around the building. At the time, I chalked it up to nerves. It didn't take long for the routine to settle in. Mop the floors, take out the trash, and avoid lingering in the body room longer than necessary. Alan mostly stayed in his office, coming out occasionally to check on me or offer some friendly small talk. At first, it felt like just another job, but little things started to bother me. small, nagging details I couldn't quite shake. For one, the body room door. I'd leave it shut after cleaning, double-checking every time. Yet I'd find it ajar later in the night when Alan was in his office or even gone altogether. The first couple of times I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the latch didn't catch. But as the nights went on, it started to feel deliberate, like the door wanted to stay open. Then there were the noises, faint, muffled sounds that I couldn't quite identify. I'd be mopping in the hallway or organizing supplies, and I'd swear I heard something coming from the metal racks in the body room. It wasn't loud, just soft, intermittent thumps, almost rhythmic. I convinced myself it was the old refrigeration system struggling to keep up, though deep down, I wasn't so sure. Alan, meanwhile, began acting different. At first, he seemed like any other boss, maybe a little quirky, but harmless enough. Over time, his quirks became harder to ignore. The way he'd disappear late at night, only to come back smelling like alcohol and cigarettes. The way he always bought snacks in sets of 4, never deviating. And then there were his comments, offhand, cryptic remarks that felt more like warnings. "Don't stay in the body room too long," he said one night, his voice unusually serious. "It's not good for you." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He looked at me for a moment, then shook his head. "Just follow the rules. Makes things easier." I wanted to press him, but something about the way he said it made me hold back. One evening, while I was sweeping near his office, I overheard him on the phone. His voice was low, almost a growl, and I couldn't make out every word, but what I did hear sent a chill through me. "They're asking too many questions," he hissed. "I told you to keep it quiet." "No, I'll handle it. Just make sure the next delivery is clean." My hands tightened on the broom handle as I listened, trying to piece together what he could possibly mean. Delivery? Clean? The words felt wrong, like they didn't belong in a place like this. The breaking point came about a week later. It was late, close to midnight, and Alan had stepped out for one of his mysterious errands. I was cleaning up in the body room, trying to ignore the faint chemical smell that clung to everything. There was a spill near the corner, formaldehyde, judging by the sharpness of the scent. I grabbed a mop and started cleaning, focusing on the steady rhythm of the strokes. That's when I felt it. A presence. Not a noise, not a movement, but the distinct sensation of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as I froze, my grip tightening on the mop handle. I forced myself to turn slowly, scanning the room. The racks stood silent, the bodies behind them still. The door was shut tight. Everything was as it should be. And yet, the feeling didn't go away. I took a shaky breath and returned to mopping, my movements more hurried now. As I worked, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished metal of one of the racks. For a split second, I thought I saw something behind me, a shadow that didn't belong. When I turned, there was nothing there. I finished cleaning as quickly as I could and left the body room without looking back. Whatever was happening here, it was starting to feel like more than just a series of coincidences. The power went out just after 11 p.m., leaving the entire building in silence. It wasn't uncommon for the old wiring to act up, especially during storm season, but it didn't make the dark any easier to handle. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to navigate the pitch-black corridors. Alan wasn't in his office. His chair was empty, his keys and jacket still hanging on the hook behind the door. I called his name, but the only response was the faint creak of the building settling. The body room door was open. Even in the dim light, I could see it swaying slightly on its hinges, as though someone had just passed through. My heart thudded in my chest, but I told myself it was the draft from the storm outside. I didn't want to go in there, but the longer I stood in the hallway, the more the silence pressed against me. I took a step inside. The smell of chemicals was stronger than usual, almost overwhelming in the stale, unmoving air. My flashlight swept across the room, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Everything seemed normal at first. The racks were lined up in their usual order, the floor clean from my earlier shift. But as the beam moved, it landed on something I hadn't noticed before. 2 of the racks had padlocks on them. I froze, staring at the heavy locks securing the metal drawers. They weren't there the last time I'd cleaned. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but none of it made sense. I stepped closer, the beam of light shaking slightly in my hand. "What the hell?" I murmured under my breath. The keys. Alan's keys. They were still in his office. Before I could talk myself out of it, I turned and headed back, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached his desk, I grabbed the key ring with trembling hands and made my way back to the body room. Standing in front of the first locked rack, I hesitated. My breathing felt too loud in the quiet, and the thought crossed my mind to just walk away. Pretend I didn't see anything and let Alan handle it. But something about those locks felt wrong, and I couldn't ignore the growing knot in my stomach. I slipped the key into the lock and turned it. The drawer creaked as I slid it open, the sound grating against the silence. My flashlight illuminated a figure inside, a young woman, no older than 20. She was alive. Her eyes were wide with fear, red from crying, and her hands were bound with thick zip ties. A strip of duct tape covered her mouth, and she shook her head frantically as she stared up at me, silently begging for help. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. This was a morgue, not this. I moved to peel the tape from her mouth, but before I could, a shadow fell across the doorway behind me. "Now you've done it." Alan's voice was calm, but when I turned to look at him, everything about his demeanor had changed. His usual friendly smile was gone, replaced with a blank expression that felt more unnerving than anger. His eyes locked on mine, unblinking, as he stepped into the room and shut the door behind him. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, his tone even, as though he were discussing a broken piece of equipment. "But I guess we'll have to deal with it now." The weight of his words sank in as the reality of the situation hit me. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was something far worse, and I was right in the middle of it. The heavy clang of the locking door echoed through the room, the sound final and suffocating. Alan turned the key slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. He slipped the keyring into his pocket, his movements deliberate, calculated. "It's funny, isn't it?" he said, his voice almost conversational. "How everything can change in an instant." I didn't reply. My mind was already scrambling for an escape route. The room was too small to offer much cover, and Alan was blocking the only exit. My eyes darted to the racks, to the table of tools by the wall, to the woman still bound in the drawer behind me. Every option felt like a dead end. Alan took a step closer, his shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor. "I didn't want this to happen, you know. I like you, Will. You are dependable. Quiet. You don't ask too many questions." But then, he gestured toward the open rack with the young woman. "You had to go and poke around." I didn't. I started, but he cut me off with a sharp shake of his head. Don't insult me by pretending you are innocent. You opened the lock, you saw her." There was no use denying it. I took a steadying breath, trying to keep my voice calm. "You don't have to do this. Let me go, and I won't say anything. I swear." Alan chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "It's not that simple. You've seen too much." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a scalpel. Its blade gleamed faintly in the dim light, catching the faint beam from my discarded flashlight. "I've always believed in patterns, Will. Rituals. They keep things in balance. Do you know why I hired you?" I didn't answer. My focus split between his words and the room around me. There had to be something I could use. A weapon, a hiding place, anything. Alan continued as if he hadn't expected a response. "You fit the pattern. I need 4 people for each cycle, 4 deliveries, 4 locks, 4. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Steps to success." "Steps to what?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear creeping into my chest. "To control," he said simply. "Luck is about control, Will. You create it, you nurture it, and you sacrifice for it." His words hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. I wasn't dealing with a man anymore. This was something else entirely. A creature of his own making, bound by rules that only made sense to him. Alan moved closer, the scalpel catching the light with each step. "I had hoped you wouldn't interfere, but now you are part of the pattern, and patterns must be completed." I backed away, my foot hitting the edge of the metal table. The tools. My hand reached behind me, fumbling until my fingers closed around a heavy pair of forceps. I kept them hidden at my side, my grip tight. "Alan, listen," I said, keeping my voice even. "We can figure this out. I won't tell anyone. You don't have to do this." But he was already shaking his head. "It's not about what I have to do. It's about what I want to do." With that, he lunged. I ducked instinctively, the scalpel slicing through the air where my head had been moments before. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging as I swung the forceps blindly. They connected with something solid, and Alan grunted in pain. I didn't wait to see the damage. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted toward the racks, skidding to a stop in front of the next padlock drawer. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, trying to find the right one. Behind me, Alan was already recovering, his footsteps uneven but deliberate. The lock clicked open. I yanked the drawer out, revealing a man. Middle-aged, his face bruised, and his hands bound like the young woman's. His eyes widened in confusion and fear. "Help is coming," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if it was a promise I could keep. The man shook his head weakly. "He'll kill you," he rasped. "You have to get out. Expose him." Alan's footsteps grew louder. I spun around just in time to see him step into the beam of the flashlight. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "You are making this harder than it needs to be, Will," he said, his voice calm but laced with something darker. "Just stop. It'll be over quickly." I didn't reply. My hand darted to the next lock, my fingers slipping on the keys as Alan advanced. The drawer slid open, revealing another captive, a young man, barely conscious. He didn't react, his body limp and unresponsive. "Stop," Alan growled, his calm facade cracking. I turned to face him, forcing myself to stay calm. "Why, Alan? Why do you need them? Why me?" His lips curled into a faint smile. "Because you were here. Because I needed 4. He lunged again, faster this time. I sidestepped, the scalpel grazing my arm. Pain flared, but I ignored it, grabbing a metal tray from the table and hurling it at him. He stumbled, and I took the opportunity to move toward the door. The captives' voices were faint behind me, urging me to run, to survive, to tell someone, anyone, what was happening here. But the door was locked, and Alan had the keys to the body room's door. I turned, my breath coming in quick bursts. Alan stood between me and the only exit, his eyes gleaming with something far worse than anger. "This isn't a game, Will," he said, his voice low. "You can't win." But I wasn't planning to win. I was planning to survive. The body room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the sound of my own uneven breathing. My back pressed against the cold metal of one of the racks as I gripped the scalpel I had managed to grab moments earlier. Alan stood a few feet away, blocking the only exit, his shadow long and looming in the dim overhead light. "You know," he began, his tone disturbingly conversational, "you remind me of the first one, bright-eyed, eager to please. He thought he could outsmart me too." I didn't respond. My focus was on his hands, watching for the slightest twitch that might signal his next move. He held a larger blade now, one he must have retrieved from the embalming station. Its edge glinted faintly, catching the pale light like a warning. "He didn't last long," Alan continued, taking a measured step closer. "None of them do. But you are putting up a fight. I can respect that." "Why are you doing this, Alan?" My voice was steadier than I expected, though my heart felt like it might burst. "What's the point of any of this?" He tilted his head, as if the question genuinely amused him. The point is order, balance. Every piece has its place, every action its consequence. You can't create luck, Will. You have to take it, shape it, mold it into something you can control. "You are insane," I said before I could stop myself. The faint smile on his face disappeared. "No, Will. I am disciplined. You could have been too, if you just stayed in your lane." With that, he lunged. I sidestepped instinctively, the scalpel in my hand coming up as a reflex. His larger blade missed me by inches, the force of his swing throwing him off balance for a split second. It was enough. I slashed at his arm, the scalpel's edge biting into flesh. Alan hissed in pain, stumbling back and clutching his wound. The air smelled of copper and formaldehyde now, the sharp scent making my stomach churn. I didn't have time to think. I bolted toward the embalming station, scanning for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a tray of tools, a bone saw, forceps, scissors. Behind me, Alan laughed, the sound low and unsettling. "You are just making this more fun, you know." I grabbed the bone saw, its weight solid and comforting in my hand. Turning to face him, I saw he was advancing again, his injured arm hanging limp at his side. His eyes were locked on mine, unwavering, as if this were some kind of game to him. "You think that's going to stop me?" he asked, nodding toward the saw. "You don't have it in you, Will. You are not a killer." Neither were they, I shot back, gesturing toward the racks. His smile returned, cold and calculating. "They were sacrifices, not killers. There is a difference." He lunged again, faster this time despite his injury. I swung the bone saw in desperation, the serrated edge catching his shoulder. He let out a grunt of pain but didn't stop, his free hand grabbing for my wrist. His grip was iron tight, and I felt the scalpel slip from my grasp, clattering to the floor. He shoved me backward, the metal table digging into my spine as I struggled to free myself. His face was inches from mine now, his breath hot and reeking of whiskey. "You should have stayed out of it," he hissed. "You could have walked away, but now..." I didn't let him finish. My free hand found the edge of the table, and I grabbed the nearest object, a glass jar filled with some kind of preservative. Without thinking, I smashed it against the side of his head. The glass shattered, the liquid spilling everywhere as Alan stumbled back, dazed. I didn't wait for him to recover. I dove for the scalpel, my fingers closing around it just as he regained his footing. This time, I didn't hesitate. I drove the scalpel into his leg, feeling the resistance of muscle and the warmth of blood as he cried out in pain. He collapsed to one knee, his weapon clattering to the floor. I didn't look back. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock until it finally gave way. The cool night air hit me like a wave, and I ran. My legs unsteady but determined to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cursed place. Behind me, I could hear Alan shouting, his voice growing fainter with each step I took. But I didn't stop. Not until I was on the main road, the morgue a dark speck in the distance. Only then did I realize I was still holding the scalpel, its blade slick with blood. My hands were trembling, my mind racing with everything I had just seen and done. But I was alive, and Alan, he wouldn't be for long. When I finally stopped running, I found myself on the edge of town, leaning against a flickering street lamp. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and my legs felt like they would give out beneath me. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to call someone, anyone. My phone shook in my hand as I dialed 911. I gave the dispatcher the address of the morgue and tried to explain what had happened. My words were jumbled, but I managed to get across the essentials. A man named Alan had been holding people captive, and there was evidence inside. "Stay where you are," the dispatcher said firmly. "Officers are on their way." I hung up, my hands still trembling. The night around me felt oppressively quiet. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should, every sound amplified in my ears. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to see Alan emerging from the darkness. The police arrived quickly. Their flashing lights painted the empty streets in shades of red and blue, a surreal contrast to the events of the night. I directed them to the morgue and stayed behind as they went inside. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, one of the officers emerged, his face grim. "There is no one here," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice uneven. "He was just there. I fought him. I stabbed him. He was right there." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before answering. "We found evidence. Locks on the racks, blood on the floor. But the suspect is gone. We'll need you to come down to the station to give a full statement." I nodded numbly, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. Alan was gone. Somehow, he had escaped. The days that followed were a blur. The police confirmed that the blood in the morgue matched Alan's DNA. They also identified the victims I had freed, who corroborated my story. Despite this, Alan remained at large. I tried to return to my routine, but normalcy felt like a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the racks in the body room. I heard the muffled cries of the captives. And, worst of all, I felt Alan's presence, like a phantom lingering in the corners of my mind. It wasn't long before strange things started happening. One evening, as I drove home from class, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. They stayed with me through every turn, every detour. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. But when I pulled into my driveway and the car slowed at the curb, only to drive off moments later, my stomach churned. Another time, I returned to my apartment to find the door slightly ajar. Inside, nothing appeared out of place. Nothing except for a single object on the kitchen table that I knew I hadn't left there. A scalpel. Then came the package. It arrived one rainy afternoon, left on my doorstep without a return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed me, mopping the floors of the morgue on my very first night. In the corner of the photo, written in red ink, were the words, asterisk. See you soon, Alan, asterisk. I sat there staring at the photo for what felt like hours. The realization that he had been watching me from the very beginning left me cold.